faded into the remote past.
Wrong. American racism does not fade on its own or dissipate after a few breakthroughs, even big ones. Systemic racism would never end in one night. To understand that racism is systemically embedded in our laws and our prisons and economy, and yes, in our brains, is to understand that it endures by default unless it's explicitly uprooted and reformed. That may be why even in this Trump era, amidst blatant racism and the Obama backlash and the comfort for white supremacists and the Proud Boys, amidst all of this, it was the incident that truly broke through, that captured the imagination, was not strictly about words or Southern statues. It was about action. The government killing an unarmed Black American, a slow, lengthy execution of a life that was legally and morally innocent, a life that pleaded to breathe, but was executed in broad daylight before a crowd over an excruciating 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It was the taking of that Black life, a Black life that mattered, in the now familiar disturbing video.
I can breathe. Please leave my dick. I can breathe here.
Bro, get up, get in the car, man.
I will.
Get up, get in the car.
I can't move.
The horrific footage showing the officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck for several minutes more after he passed out, grinding out that killing, sparking a movement, protests rippling across 2,000 cities this year. Some lasted for months, pressure that led to some changes in policy and personnel, including a rare murder charge for the officer. But the protests did not halt routine incidents like this, officers shooting this man 7 times in the back as he walked away unarmed. Didn't stop things like the first responder Breonna Taylor, whom police shot to death in the middle of the night in her own apartment this year. This year's protests forced more Americans to face these realities and see they're not about some kind of rare exception or just bad apples. Americans reminded this year of other lives that mattered, other innocent Black people killed. Walter Scott, shot to death in the back. Laquan McDonald, 17 and shot to death with 16 police bullets. Freddie Gray, tossed into a van where he died of a neck injury. Eric Garner, a father choked to death in broad daylight in an eerie precursor to the George Floyd video that upset so many Americans. Linwood Lambert, who police handcuffed and drove to a hospital where he was supposed to get needed medical care. He was denied that by police, who used their tasers 20 times. He died in police custody. Each story about each life may break through more than the numbers, but here in the news, we'll show you the numbers tell the same story. Police kill about 1,000 people a year. The rate continuing at the same pace this year, 804 killings so far, per the Washington Post. It's the same pace for charges. Before 2016, police could go years in a row without a single murder conviction, despite thousands of killings. Now that's ticked up slightly in just these most egregious killings caught on tape. One officer convicted about per year over the past 5 years, in research by Philip Stinson. Now, just as some Americans rush to overestimate how Obama's victory might end racism, this year it would be the wrong lesson to assume that the scrutiny I just showed you on police brutality and racism is curbing the actual deployment of systemic racism. So all of that drove the protests. But numerically, police brutality is actually the smallest part of systemic racism. Yes, all those videos that you just saw there about the sliver of the justice system that just deals with arrests, the first part of any police interaction. But the majority of the economic and racial injustice exists elsewhere. So, for example, in America, did you know that most of the people in our jails are innocent? That sounds weird, right? But under the cash bail system, if you're rich, you're innocent until proven guilty and you prepare for trial at home. If you're not, you're innocent until proven guilty, but stuck in jail until trial because you can't pay bail. Well, being in jail doesn't feel very innocent. Most people in our jails are awaiting trial. 90% can't afford bail. The system disproportionately discriminates against Black Americans, from how judges apply it to the higher poverty rates driving incarceration. Now, those are numbers. Here's a person. 28-year-old Sandra Bland was pulled over for not using a turn signal, then arrested, then jailed on a $5,000 bond that she couldn't afford. Now, she later died in jail, bringing extra scrutiny to her case, but most Americans cannot afford these bonds. And the over-policing of Black Americans means they run into this cash problem more often. That's just bail. Then there's the trial itself. Americans see crime shows where everyone gets their day in court, but that's fiction. Most cases never go to trial like that. And you can see why tonight. Legally innocent defendants held in jail, where they lose their jobs if they have them, no money for bail or a good lawyer. They face huge pressure to plea, and most take the deals. That's unfair to the poor and tilted by race because prosecutors systematically push more jail and plea deals for black defendants than whites. And then judges sentence them to more time for the same crime, especially in the drug charges that clog our system. So black Americans end up imprisoned at 5 times the rate. So those police brutality videos are important this year, but they are simply the most visible, shocking part of this much wider system, which is harder to catch on video, harder to swiftly expose all its cruel catch-22s and raw deals. Now, the iconic filmmaker Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th does some of that, showing how slavery is the foundation for mass incarceration.
It's with the Nixon era and the law and order period when crime begins to stand in for race. The prison industrial complex relies historically on the inheritances of slavery.
And in that Nixon era, those White House aides for Nixon later admitted they saw the war on drugs as a way to get the public to associate blacks with heroin, to criminalize them and disrupt those communities. From DuVernay to the scholar Michelle Alexander to the writer James Baldwin, many have emphasized these are not new systems. They continue old ones.
We are still governed by the slave codes. Now, when I say a slave rebellion, I mean that what is called the civil rights movement was really insurrection.
So everything I just told you is actually just a relatively brief tour of racism in criminal justice, which itself is one slice of systemic racism in the rest of America. For that, I want to go just briefly through a top 10 list. Number 10, the American dream of owning a home. Most white Americans do, compared to a minority of black Americans. 9, the dream in any meritocracy, higher education. Most whites graduate college, most black Americans don't. And the racial wealth gap persists apart from education, bringing us to 8. White American households with only a high school diploma make about $100,000 a year. Way more, 10 times more than the wealth of black households with the same exact education. It gets worse. 7 in 10 Americans today, I should say 7 on our list of 10. If you're a white person with only a high school degree in America today, you're going to make more than a black American with a bachelor's degree. So when you hear that people should just pull themselves up and get an education, get to work, remember, race kicks in to block fair pay for that progress regardless. Here's another example of how, bringing us to number 6. Statistically, many employers prefer to hire a white, formerly convicted criminal over a black applicant with no record. Think about that. That's all just business as usual. And it stokes wider inequities for when new problems hit. Like 5, the recession hits everyone, but it's hitting black communities harder. 4, the pandemic pushing far more black Americans into hunger. And 3, into missing housing payments. And 2, driving more black businesses into bankruptcy than other companies. All the way to number 1 right now. All the long-term factors that make black Americans twice as likely to die from the coronavirus. So that's a lot to take in. I'm going through all this with you right now in this campaign home stretch for a reason. We have to take these things in together because even in the rare times when the U.S. does try to stand up and face racism, it's piecemeal. So protesters force a conversation, but it fixates on just police, with those debates about training or defunding them. But as I showed you tonight, police brutality is one part of racism and justice, which is one part, the justice system, of the wider system. And it's no accident that the protests are met with fierce crackdowns and Trumpian claims that they're just about looting or chaos. It's the same playbook. Drown out the message with attacks on the messenger. Civil rights activist Angela Davis called out this tendency to muzzle the revolutionaries' content. And remember what I was reporting just tonight about the bail system? Well, note that she makes this point while jailed before a trial where she was later cleared of all charges.
The real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions.
And much of that violence comes from the state. Many have noted that curbing state violence through even meager historical civil rights measures still functions to protect the elite.
Every civil rights bill in this country was passed for white people.
Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists.
White people beat up black people every day. Don't nobody talk about nonviolence, but as soon as black people start to move, the double standard comes into being.
That's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible.
Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
MLK arguing that justice is right, but it's also good for a safe society. And when we face racism, we must face that for all the talk about nonviolence in the 60s or now, it's of course violence that took down many black leaders.
We all know what happened to Malcolm. We all know what happened to Martin. The list is long. That is the result of a slave rebellion.
Baldwin bringing it back to that prism of a slave rebellion. Now, we're almost done with this piece tonight, but the last part is key. Because this history lives on. These same dilemmas about radicalism and racism were later tackled by a 34-year-old American who had yet to win any political office, recounting why Malcolm X inspired him as an even younger man.
The section that I'm going to read for you right now takes place during my adolescence. And I'm a very angry man. Only Malcolm X's autobiography seemed to offer something different. We were always playing on the white man's court. The only thing you could choose as your own was withdrawal into a smaller and smaller coil of rage, until being black meant only the knowledge of your own powerlessness. Should you refuse this defeat and lash out at your captors, they would have a name for that too. A name that could cage you just as good. Like paranoid, or militant, or violent, or
A 34-year-old Barack Obama wrestling with the depth of America's racism, recounting Malcolm X's inspiration, and also explaining why he, Obama, broke with that militance, facing his own heritage and seeking a new world.
Down the road to self-respect, my own white blood would never recede into mere abstraction. So I was left to wonder what else I would be severing if and when I left my mother and my grandparents at some uncharted border. And two, if Malcolm's discovery towards the end of his life that some whites might live beside him as brothers in Islam seemed to offer some hope of eventual reconciliation, where were the people who would work towards this future and populate this new world?
Obama took that spirit all the way to the White House and moved a Democratic Party that, to be clear, does not have some universally great record here. There was racial progress in the civil rights era, and then many Democrats took steps backwards in fortifying mass incarceration. Democratic politicians don't admit it, but there are certainly elections where Democrats don't offer enough contrast on ending systemic racism. But all this history is news tonight, because this year's not one of those draws. This year's a fundamental reckoning. This year, people are rising. A movement is growing, diverse in race and age and geography, and we are facing the ultimate contrast, confronting a man who fomented racism long before he was in politics, who rode the racist birther lies against Barack Obama as his ticket into the Republican Party, who pledged to make bigotry U.S. policy. This is what is on the ballot now. So every voter must answer. Are you for or against this?
Let's all hate these people, because maybe hate is what we need. The first thing they do is start shouting police brutality.
He was born in Kenya and he lived in Indonesia.
The state of Hawaii says this is official. He was born in Hawaii.
A lot of people do not think it was an authentic certificate.
Total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Knock the crap out of him, would you? Seriously. I will pay for the legal fees, I promise.
Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke?
I don't know anything about David Duke.
I'm just talking about David Duke and the Ku Klux Klan here, but...
I don't know, honestly, I don't know David Duke. Look at my African American over here.
We're building a wall. He's a Mexican. He is giving us very unfair rulings.
He's not from Mexico.
In my opinion,
he's from Indiana.
He is his Mexican heritage. These thugs being thrown into the back of a paddy wagon. I said, please don't be too nice.
Very fine people on both sides.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these countries here?
These are people. These are animals.
He once asked me if I could name a country run by a black person that wasn't a
Female Democrat congresswomen who are foreign born, he suggests, should go back to where they came from.
Have you heard the president use the N-word? Yeah.
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
There's a saying, what's understood does not need to be explained. Racists understand exactly what's going on here. And so do the anti-racists backing civil rights for all people. And maybe some people out there didn't get it. People are busy making a living. People tune out information in the news. Maybe some did not fully understand all this before. But even for anyone who had doubts or confusion, it's all out in the open in 2020. Consider it explained.